Old Eurycleia rose before dawn again, before the sun's disk could leap from the wine-dark sea to announce to the Mediterranean that a new day had come. Out of long habit, she stands in the doorway of the storeroom in the palace of cunning Odysseus on Ithaca, her fingers tracing the bronze keys. Their jingle like the little bells they used to hang around the necks of the goats in those summers when the boy Odysseus was learning to run across these stone floors. In every truly old house, there is someone who remembers how the walls smelled before war moved in, and in every palace, there is a shadow that knows where the keys to all the doors are kept, and that remembers what this world was like when it was still whole. All the great warriors whose names thundered beneath the walls of Troy were once little boys, held in someone's arms, scraping and bruising their knees, afraid of the dark, sleeping with their noses buried in the shoulder of an old nurse. And if you think history begins with battles and ships, you are mistaken. It begins with a newborn being lowered into warm water for the first time, old hands washing him, and a voice that will echo in his memory until the day he dies whispering to the mother, "A boy, you have a boy." Before she became the nurse of the future cunning king of Ithaca, Eurycleia was his midwife. She received him from his mother's womb, her hands the first to touch his wet head, and she lifted him to the light and whispered, "Well, hello there, my little fox." She remembered him like that, wet, tiny, crying. And she remembered the moment he first opened his eyes and looked at her as if she were the whole world. And from that day on, she carried him in her heart like a lamp carried through a dark hallway. And she looked at him with pride, serious, grown, strong, a hero of the Trojan War. Tonight, we will enter a house where the keys to every room rest in one pair of hands, hands that are growing old but will not let go. And we will see a woman who ruled not from a throne, but from the memory of what a home ought to be. She survived war, hunger, the invasion of the suitors, and her own loneliness, but she never let go of the keys because she knew the master would return. And he did return, not as a king, but as a beggar, not as a hero, but as a stranger, and she recognized him by the scar she herself had stitched up many years before. And when he stood before her after everything that had happened, about which the great blind bard Homer would later sing, she did not weep or cry out. She simply said, "Dinner is at noon, as always, and don't be late," as if those 20 years of separation had never been, as if time had simply stopped and waited for him to come home. So let this story, smelling of olive oil and dried figs, carry you into sleep, where each of us was once a little boy or girl, and someone held us in their arms and whispered that we were their sunshine, and where even after the longest parting, we are awaited by the one who remembers us as we were at the very beginning. And I remind you, for those who leave likes and comments on the channel, the ancient god of dreams Morpheus sets aside dreams from a special shining box adorned with a green little branch. These are among the best dreams you can see since you ceased to be children. The market in Ithaca awoke early, long before the sun had time to touch the tops of the olive groves, and its voices, deep and rough, mingled with the lowing of cattle and the clinking of metal, were the first sounds that this small rocky island heard when the world was still young and the gods did not hide from mortals behind their clouds. At the center of this living, breathing, fish and sweat-smelling crowd stood a girl whose eyes were wider than the others, and whose hands, still unacquainted with bronze keys, clutched the edge of her rough tunic as if she feared the wind might carry her away. Her name was Eurycleia, and her name, which meant possessing wide fame, was something she carried with pride even when her world was crumbling around her, because she was the daughter of Ops, whose name meant sharp-eyed, and the granddaughter of Paysignor, the persuader of men. And these names, like her own blood, spoke of one who was born not to stand in a market, but to be someone of importance. She was born free. She was of noble birth, and her childhood smelled not of fish and sweat, but of incense and dried herbs. And her hands, when she was small, touched not rough tunics, but fine fabrics brought from distant lands. But fate, like the wine-dark sea, does not ask who you are or where you come from when it decides to change your life. Her family fell into ruin, or she was taken in a raid, or something else that Homer did not see fit to describe, because for him Eurycleia was already the one who stands in the shadow of great heroes, not the one who stood in the market, clutching her tunic and looking at the people who assessed her as they assess cattle sold for slaughter. She stood on the wooden platform, and her face, which had once seen only the light of the family hearth, was now turned toward the crowd, and her eyes, which had once seen only the faces of her kin, now saw the faces of strangers who looked at her with greed, with curiosity, with that cold, calculating interest that people have when they buy a person as a thing. She heard the men whispering, assessing her age, her health, her beauty, and her heart, which had once been as clear as the sky over Ithaca, now tightened with fear, but she did not show it, because she was the daughter of Ops and the granddaughter of Paysignor, and she knew that even in the darkest hour one must keep one's back straight and look forward, as those who know that their fate is already written, and that they cannot change it, but can meet it with dignity. The crowd hummed like the sea before a storm, and the voices of the haggling mingled with the lowing of cattle, and the clinking of coins as they fell on wooden counters was like the sound of rain drumming on a roof when you sit inside and know that you do not have to go out. But she was not sitting inside. She was standing on the platform, and the wind from the sea tousled her hair, and she thought that her life, which had been so short and so bright, had just changed forever, and that she would never again be who she was. And when she heard a voice that was as firm as stone walls and as calm as the surface of water on a windless day, she looked up. The man who stood before her was older than she had expected, but in his eyes there was none of the greed she had seen in the others. There was only silence, the same silence that was in her heart when she looked at the sea and thought that her life, which had been so short and so bright, had just changed forever. He looked at her as if he saw not just a slave, but something more, something he could not put into words but felt with every cell of his body. He was Laertes, king of Ithaca, father of the one who was to become the greatest hero of Greece, and he looked at her as if he already knew that she would be the one who would hold his son in her arms when he was born, and who would remember his home when everything else had fallen. He approached her, and his voice, when he spoke, was as soft as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as the sunlight that filters through the leaves. "You will live with us," he said. "You will be the nurse for our children. I do not know what brought you to this market, but I know that you should not be here. I know you were born for greater things, and I give you my word. In my house you will be not a slave, but one who is respected." She looked at him, and her eyes, which had seen so much fear and so much pain, filled with tears, but she did not cry, because she was the daughter of Ops and the granddaughter of Paysignor, and she knew that tears would not help when fate had already made its choice. She nodded, and in that nod was everything she could not say in words: her gratitude, her hope, her promise that she would keep his home as one keeps a lamp in a dark corridor, and that she would remember his son when he grew up and became a legend, and that she would wait for his return, even when the whole world said he would never come back. When Laertes named the price, a silence fell upon the marketplace. It was not the silence that comes when everyone holds their breath, but the silence that follows a clap of thunder when people still cannot believe their ears and wait for someone to say, "This is a joke." But Laertes was not joking. He stood before the merchant, and his face was as calm as the surface of the water on a windless day, and his voice, when he repeated the price, was as firm as the rocks upon which Ithaca stood. 20 oxen, he said, and each word fell to the ground like a stone that can no longer be lifted. I pay 20 oxen for this girl, not for her hands, not for her back, not for her health, for her name, for her blood, for what she can give to my house that I cannot buy with any amount of money. The merchant looked at him, and his eyes, which had seen thousands of transactions, were as wide as the eyes of Eurycleia when she heard this price. He knew that Laertes was not bargaining. He knew that Laertes was not paying for a slave, but for something greater, for something that had no price, because price was meaningless when it came to a home that must be built not of stone, but of memory. He nodded, and his hand, when he extended it for the handshake, trembled. 20 oxen, he repeated, and his voice was quiet, but there was respect in it. I have never seen anyone pay such a price for a girl. She must be special. Laertes did not answer. He simply turned to Eurycleia and looked at her as if she were already part of his house. He did not explain why he had paid so much, did not tell her his plans, did not speak to her of what she would do in his home. He simply said, "Come," and she followed him. They walked through the marketplace, and her feet, as they stepped upon the dusty earth, were as light as her breath and as heavy as her destiny, which had just changed forever. She heard the people whispering behind her, their voices full of surprise and curiosity, mingling with the lowing of cattle and the ringing of metal, and she felt their gazes upon her, like touches she could not wash away. But she did not turn around. She followed Laertes, and her eyes, as they looked at his back, were as wide as her soul, which seemed at last to have found its path. When they approached the palace, when her feet touched the stone floor that remembered the footsteps of kings and heroes, she stopped. She stood in the doorway, and her eyes, as they looked at the walls, were as wide as her heart, which beat in time with her breath. On the walls were frescoes, dolphins and octopuses dancing in the light of oil lamps, their bodies as alive as the sea from which they came, and their eyes, as they looked at her, were as warm as the light that fell upon them. She heard, somewhere in the depths of the palace, the loom of a weaving woman, and its sound was like the heartbeat of the house, beating in time with her own. She smelled olive oil and dried figs, and these smells, like names, would remain in her memory forever, becoming the map of the world she would guard when all else had crumbled. She stood in the doorway, and her hands, which had trembled at the marketplace, now lay upon her chest, and she looked at this house, which was to become her home, and her eyes, as they looked upon this place, were full of the same light that had been in the eyes of Laertes when he paid 20 oxen for her. She did not know what lay ahead of her. She did not know that she would become the one who would hold in her arms a little boy who would become the greatest hero of Greece. She did not know that her hands, which now trembled, would be the ones to recognize him by his scar after 20 years of separation. She only knew that she stood in this house, and that this house smelled of olive oil and dried figs, and that her heart, which had been so cold and empty, was beginning to fill with something new, something that was like hope. And when Laertes turned to her and said, "Welcome home, Eurycleia," she felt her eyes fill with tears, but she did not weep, because she was the daughter of Ops and the granddaughter of Paesenor, and she knew that tears would not help when you stand on the threshold of a new life. She simply nodded, and in that nod was everything she could not say in words: her gratitude, her hope, her promise to be faithful to her king. A servant, old and silent, his face cut with wrinkles like an old map, gestured for her to follow him. He spoke not a single word, but in his eyes, as he looked at her, there was neither curiosity nor contempt, only that calm respectfulness that appears in the eyes of those who know that before them stands not merely a new servant, but someone whom the king himself had honored with his price. They entered the great hall, the Megaron, and Eurycleia stopped, because she had never seen anything like it in all her life. Tall columns, painted in warm terracotta, rose up toward the ceiling, which vanished into the half-darkness. Their capitals were decorated with spirals and leaves carved into the stone with such care that it seemed the craftsman who had made them was in no hurry, knowing that his work would stand here for centuries. Between the columns, on the walls, frescoes danced. Dolphins with arched backs leaped from the waves, their tails gleaming in blue and green, as if the wine-dark sea that had birthed them still flowed across these walls. Beside them, octopuses, their tentacles curved in smooth movement, were painted with such precision that it seemed they were about to come alive and crawl across the stone. She stood and looked, and her breath, as she looked at these frescoes, was as light as her steps when she followed the servant. She knew that such images were not mere decoration. They were the story that the walls told to those who knew how to listen. They spoke of the sea, which was the home of her ancestors, of the dolphins that saved sailors, of the octopuses that hid in the depths, as secrets hide that must not be revealed. And she felt these stories, these images, these colors entering her, as light enters a dark room when the door is opened. The servant led her further, into a corridor where the walls were made of rough stone and the floor of smooth slabs that were as warm as the hands that touched them. He showed her a staircase cut into the rock, steps that led up to the second floor, and further to the third, where, she understood, the royal family lived, Laertes and his wife Andoclea. The steps were wide but steep, and her feet, as she stepped upon them, felt how the stone remembered the steps of those who had climbed here before her and prophetically anticipated those not yet born, whose steps would be written into this stone, like letters in a book that no one would ever be able to read to the end. She climbed to the second floor, and here, in a small room with a window facing the sea, the servant stopped and pointed to a door. "Your room," he said, and his voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass. "The master asked me to give you the keys. They will be yours tomorrow. For now, rest. You are home." She entered the room, and her eyes, as they grew accustomed to the half-light, saw a simple but well-made bed covered with a sheepskin, a clay lamp on a small table, and a wooden chest against the wall. She walked to the window and looked out. Below, in the valley, she saw gardens that descended toward the sea, and olive groves that seemed to reach toward the water like hands that wished to touch it. She heard the wind rustling in the leaves, and somewhere below, the sound of water trickling. It was the well, which she would later learn had been cut into the rock in those times when the gods walked the earth, and which fed the entire palace with water, clear and cold as tears. She stood at the window, and her hands, which had trembled at the marketplace, now rested on the windowsill, and she looked at this place, which was to become her new home, which smelled of olive oil and dried figs. She turned to the servant, who still stood at the door, and asked, "Where is Laertes? Where is he now?" The servant shook his head. "He is in the Megaron. He said you may join them for dinner if you wish. But if you are tired, you may stay here. He will not demand your presence." Eurycleia thought for a moment. She was tired from the marketplace, from the fear, from the uncertainty that awaited her in this new world. But she also felt that her place was not here, in this room, but down there, where the light burned and where Laertes and his wife were waiting for her. She nodded and said, "I will go. I want to see him and meet the lady. I want to thank them." The servant smiled, and in that smile there was something warm, like sunlight that filters through the leaves. "Then come," he said. "They will be glad." And she followed him, down the staircase cut into the rock, past the frescoes of dolphins and octopuses, past the columns that were as tall as her hope, and when she entered the Megaron, she saw the royal couple sitting by the hearth. Laertes sat in a high chair, his hands resting on the armrests, and his face, illuminated by the firelight of the hearth, was as calm as the surface of the water on a windless day. Beside him, on a low bench, sat Eurycleia, his wife, whose eyes, when she looked at Eurycleia, were as warm as the light that fell upon her face. She did not smile, but in her gaze there was neither fear nor jealousy, only that quiet, calm wisdom that belongs to women who know that their home is not merely walls, but something greater, something that cannot be destroyed by time or war. "Come closer, Eurycleia," said Laertes, and his voice was as steady as his breathing, and as warm as the fire that burned in the hearth. "I want you to know who you are now in this house. You are not a slave. You are not a servant. You are part of this house, and I want you to understand that from the very beginning." He reached out his hand, and his fingers, when they touched her shoulder, were as light as the feathers of a bird that settles upon a branch. She raised her eyes, and her gaze met his, and in that gaze there was no male desire, no greed, no darkness of the kind she had so feared to see. There was only the same stillness that was in her heart when she stood at the marketplace and looked at the sea. He looked at her as if she were not merely a newly purchased slave, but something greater, something he must protect because it was fragile and priceless, like a lamp that must not be dropped. "You will live with us," he said. "You will care for our son when he is born. You will teach him what you know yourself: kindness, honor, respect for the house he will inherit. And I want you to know, I will never lay claim to you as a woman. I will not share your bed. You will be free of that. You will be the one who keeps the house, not the one who serves it with her body." She did not know what to say. She had heard stories of kings who bought slaves and made them concubines, of women who lost their honor and their souls in foreign houses. She had heard of how kings looked upon their slaves with the same greed with which they looked upon gold and cattle. But Laertes looked at her differently. He looked at her as if she were his daughter, his sister, someone who must be protected, not used. And in that gaze there was something that made her heart beat faster, but not from fear, from something she could not name, from hope that was like light filtering through leaves, and like warmth that does not fade even when the fire dies down. She lowered her head and whispered, "I will keep this house. I will keep it as it is, and I will never betray you, Laertes. I promise you this." Laertes nodded and rose from his place and walked to the chest that stood against the wall. He opened it and took out a ring of bronze keys, large and heavy, with patterns carved upon them that were like waves and dolphins and octopuses that danced upon the frescoes. He turned to her and held them out. "These are the keys to all the storerooms," he said, "to the pantries, to the amphory, to the chests in which our wealth is kept. I trust you to guard them. You will know where every cup lies, every amphora of oil, every grain in our granaries. You will be the one who knows what we have, and who remembers what we have lost. You will be the keeper of this house." She took the keys, and their weight, as they lay in her palms, was as heavy as her destiny and as light as her breath. She closed her fingers around them, and the sound they made was like the sound of little bells they used to hang around the necks of young goats in those summers when she was small and did not know what fear was. She looked at them, and her eyes, as she looked at these keys, were full of the same light that had been in the eyes of Laertes when he paid 20 oxen for her. She knew that these keys were not merely metal. They were a symbol of trust, a symbol of respect, a symbol that she was part of this house, as much as the walls, as much as the frescoes, as much as the hearth that burned in the center of the Megaron and gave warmth to all who entered it. The next morning, when the sun had only just begun to rise above the horizon, painting the sky in those tender shades of rose and gold that bloom each summer over the Ionian Sea, Eurycleia, the wife of Laertes, came to Eurycleia's room and found her already standing at the window, clutching in her hands the keys she had received the evening before. The ring was heavy and warm. It held 8 large bronze keys, and each one opened its own lock. One for the main storeroom with its amphory of oil, another for the granary, a third for the chest of wine, a fourth for the room where herbs were dried, and 4 more whose names Eurycleia did not yet know, but which, she already felt, would become as familiar to her as her own name. "Come," said Eurycleia, and her voice was soft as the whisper of waves, and warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. "I will show you the house. I will tell you how it lives. You must know everything if you wish to be its keeper." They walked through the corridors, and Eurycleia, who had grown accustomed to the silence of her room, now heard the house waking up. Somewhere below, in the kitchen, knives were already striking, and the smell of fresh bread, just set in the oven, rose upward, mingling with the scent of olive oil and dried figs. She heard the voices of the serving women talking among themselves, their laughter, their footsteps, their songs that they sang to make the time pass more quickly. She felt the house breathing, waking each morning, living its life that continued even when everyone slept. "We have 50 serving women," said Eurycleia, leading her down the stairs. 3 in the kitchen, for weavers, 5 cleaners, 2 washerwomen, 2 at the stable, and 4 who help in the storerooms and warehouses. The rest of the girls are occupied in the workshops where they weave materials not for our house, but for sale. And there are also shepherds who live outside the city, and servants who tend the gardens. They entered the main storeroom, and Eurycleia stopped at the threshold, because she had never in her life seen so many amphorae. They stood in rows, tall and brown, covered with a layer of dust that, she knew, was not dirt but time itself, which had settled upon them as silence settles after a long day. On each amphora were inscriptions, letters carved into the clay, telling what was inside: olive oil from the hills where black sheep grazed, wine from the vineyards planted by the grandfather of Laertes, honey gathered on the slopes of Mount Neriton, grain stored for the winter. Eurycleia walked to one of the amphorae and gently ran her hand over its surface. "This is special oil," she said. "We keep it for festivals, for weddings, for the birth of children, for for the return for more. Each amphora is a hope. It is a promise that life continues, even when it seems to have stopped. She walked further, to the next row of amphorae, and Eurycleia followed her, listening as the clinking of her keys, when she moved them with her fingers, mingled with the echo that spread through the storeroom. "Here is the wine," continued Anticlea. "We pour it into cups when guests arrive and when we celebrate, but we never drink it alone. Wine is not merely a drink. It is memory. It is communion. It is what connects us to those who came before us." She walked to the next amphora, which stood slightly apart, and her voice, when she spoke, became softer and more thoughtful. "And this is honey. It is gathered on the slopes of Mount Neriton, here on Ithaca itself, where the slopes grown with wild thyme and oregano give the bees their sweetest nectar. We use it for medicines, for sweets, and for sweetening wine when it is too sour. Sometimes we sell it to merchants who come from the mainland, for the honey of Ithaca is famous for its aroma. But the main thing we do with honey is that we keep it, because honey does not spoil. It can wait as we wait, as the house waits." She paused, and in her eyes, as she looked at the amphorae, there was the same stillness that was in her heart when she spoke of the house. "Ithaca is not a wealthy kingdom," she said, and her voice was quiet, but there was pride in it. "We have no gold mines, no vast fields, no great herds. Our land is rocky, and it does not give us the abundance that other kings enjoy. But we have the sea. We have olives that grow even on the most barren slopes. We have grapes that give wine equal to any from the mainland. We have honey that merchants value because it smells of wild thyme and sun. And we have our people, those who know how to survive on this land, how to grow a harvest where nothing seems to grow, how to keep a house even when the world crumbles around it. We are not rich, Eurycleia, but we are strong, and we are noble." She took Eurycleia by the hand and led her further, and in that touch was the same tenderness that was in her voice when she spoke of honey and wine. "Come," she said, "I will show you one more room, the one where we keep what is most precious." They entered a room that was smaller than the others, and in its center stood a chest that was larger and more beautiful than the rest. It was made of cedar, and its lid was decorated with carvings, dolphins and octopuses and waves that danced upon its surface, as if the sea that surrounded this island had been carved into the wood itself. Anticlea opened it, and Eurycleia saw inside fabrics, soft as the skin of an infant, and gleaming as water in the light of sunset. They were as beautiful as the frescoes on the walls, and as ancient as the gods themselves. "These are for weddings," said Anticlea, "for the birth of children, for the return of heroes. We keep them here because they are our wealth. Not gold, not silver, but the memory of what we were and of what we will become." Eurycleia clenched the keys in her hand, and their clinking, as they touched one another, was like the promise she had made to herself in the moment she first crossed the threshold. She would keep this house, as one keeps a lamp in a dark corridor, and she would remember this moment when she first held the keys in her hands, and she would serve this royal family with faith and truth until the day the light faded from her eyes forever. And Anticlea very much needed such a devoted helper. She was already with child. On that night when Anticlea felt the first pains of labor, the moon had long since disappeared below the horizon, and the palace had sunk into that deep, almost tangible silence that comes only before dawn, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. In the queen's chamber, oil lamps burned, their light, as it fell upon the walls, as warm as the hands that had already begun to prepare for what was about to happen. Eurycleia, who had not been sleeping and had been listening to every sound that came from the corridor, entered the room, her steps as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass. She knew her time had come. She knew that this moment was one of those for which she had been purchased, for which she had crossed the threshold of this house, for which she had received the keys to all the storerooms. She approached Aunt Eurycleia's bed, and her hands, when they touched the queen's forehead, were as cool as the water she had prepared for the washing. "Everything will be well," she said, and her voice was as steady as her breathing, and as warm as the light that fell upon her face. "I am here. I will not leave you." She turned to the serving women who stood at the door, and her voice, when she spoke, was as calm as the surface of the water on a windless day. "Bring warm water, plenty of water, and clean cloths, and prepare the bronze basins. Quickly, but without haste. We must not rush. We must do everything correctly." The serving women stirred, their steps quick but silent, and in their movements was the same confidence that was in the voice of Eurycleia. They brought water, heated over the hearth, and it was warm, almost hot, and its steam, as it rose above the bronze basins, was as light as the breath that escapes from the chest when you know that all will be well. They brought clean linen cloths, as soft as the skin of a newborn, and folded them beside the bed, ready for the moment they would be needed. One of the serving women, a young girl with a face as pale as her fear, stood at the door and waited for Eurycleia to tell her what to do. "Go to Lord Laertes," Eurycleia told her. "Tell him all is going well. Tell him he will be a father in a few hours. And tell him to send no one to ask questions. We will send word as soon as the child is born." The serving girl nodded and disappeared into the corridor. Eurycleia turned to Aunt Eurycleia, and her hands, when they touched her face, were as gentle as the hands of a mother stroking the face of her child. "Now breathe," she said. "Breathe deeply, and do not be afraid. I am here. I will not leave you." And she began to prepare for the delivery. Her hands, which had once trembled at the marketplace, were now as sure as the hands of a sculptor shaping form from clay. And her movements were as smooth as the waves that roll onto the shore, and as precise as the strike of a hammer upon an anvil. She whispered words as ancient as the gods themselves, and her voice, when she spoke them, was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. "So be it," she whispered. "Let the child be strong. Let him be wise. Let him be one who remembers his home, even when he is far away. Let him be one who will return." Somehow she was certain a boy would be born, and when the cry of the infant tore through the silence, when his voice, piercing and strong, filled the room, Eurycleia lifted him into her arms. He was small, so small that his body fit into her palms, and his skin was wet and warm, and his eyes, when he opened them for the first time, were as dark as the sea that surrounded this island. He looked at her as if she were the entire world, and she looked at him as if he were her sun, her light, her hope. She brought him toward the light, and in that light, as it fell upon his face, there was something that made the heart beat faster. She whispered words that were meant only for him, words she wanted him to remember when he grew up. "Well, hello there, my little fox," she whispered. "Hello, my little clever one. You will be a great warrior. You will be a hero, but first you will be mine. You will be my boy, and I will care for you until you are strong enough to care for yourself." She wrapped him in the soft linen cloth, and as she held him in her arms, she felt his small body, so warm and so alive, beating in time with her heart. She knew that this moment would remain with her forever, as forever remain those moments when you understand that your life has changed and that it has become greater than you could have imagined. She handed him to Eurycleia, who lay on the bed, her face pale, but in her eyes was the same light that had been in the eyes of Eurycleia when she held the infant in her arms. She took him, and her hands, as she held him, trembled, but not from weakness, from the strength that was in her as she looked upon her son. "He looks like Laertes," said Eurycleia, and her voice was quiet, but there was pride in it. "He looks like my king, Eurycleia. He has his eyes, his soul. Oh, what a beautiful son I have." Eurycleia did not answer. She simply stood beside the bed, and her hands, which still remembered the warmth of his body, rested on her chest, and she looked at this boy who would become the greatest hero of Greece, and she knew that her life, which had been so short and so uncertain, now had meaning. She would be the prince's nurse. She would be his keeper. She would be the one who held him in her arms when he first opened his eyes, and she would be the one who would wait for his return when he someday left for some war and would surely become a legend. Eurycleia turned to one of the serving women and said, "Tell Laertes that a boy has been born, and all is well." Some time later, the house of Laertes was filled with that special, tremulous anticipation that comes only before the arrival of the most important guest. The serving women hurried through the corridors, polishing bronze and fluffing the beds, and in the kitchen they had been baking honey cakes and roasting meat since morning to properly welcome the grandfather of the newborn. For not every day does a man enter the house whose name is spoken with as much fear as respect, which, surprisingly, is understandable, because Eurycleia was the daughter of the craftiest and most legendary thief of Greece, Autolycus. Autolycus arrived as the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, and his shadow, long and dark, fell upon the threshold before he himself stepped across it. He was old, but his eyes, as they looked upon the world, were as sharp as the edge of a knife, and in them burned the same fire that burned in the eyes of his father Hermes, the god of thieves and tricksters. His hands, which had once stolen from kings and deceived the gods themselves, now rested upon the shoulders of his daughter Eurycleia, and his voice, when he spoke, was as hoarse as the creak of an old oak, and as warm as the hearth by which he sat. "Show me my grandson," he said, and his voice was quiet, but in it was the same authority that was in his father when he commanded the gods. "I want to see the one who will carry my blood and my destiny." Eurycleia, who held the infant in her arms, approached him, and her steps were as light as her breath and as firm as her resolve. She placed the child in Autolycus's arms, and her hands, as they released him, trembled, but not from fear, from the strength that was in her as she watched this man who was to give a name to the one she loved more than anything in the world. Autolycus took the infant onto his knees, and his hands, as he held him, were as gentle as the hands of a mother holding her child. He looked at him for a long time, and in his eyes was the same stillness that was in his heart when he stood on Mount Parnassus and looked at the stars. He saw in this child not merely an heir, but a continuation of his destiny, his gift. He saw a boy who would inherit his cunning, his mind, his ability to deceive and to survive. And he knew that the name he would give him would not be merely a word, but a destiny. "I have come here as one who has brought upon himself the anger of many men and many women," he said, and his voice was as steady as the surface of the water on a windless day, and in it there was neither pride nor shame, only the stillness that was in his heart as he looked upon this child. "I have come here because I am the one who causes hatred, the one who brings pain, the one who was never forgiven. And therefore let this child's name be Odysseus. Let him be the angry one. Let him be the hater. Let him be the one who causes anger and hatred. Let his name remind him that he is my grandson, and that he carries my blood and my destiny." He fell silent, and in the silence that followed his words, only the crackling of the fire in the hearth could be heard, and the breathing of the infant who lay upon his knees and looked at him as if he already understood that his destiny had been decided. Eurycleia stood nearby, and her hands, which still remembered the warmth of his body, rested upon her chest, and she looked at this boy who would become the greatest hero of Greece, and she knew that his name, Odysseus, would not be merely a word, but a promise that he must fulfill. "Odysseus," she whispered, and this name, as she spoke it, was like light filtering through leaves, and like warmth that does not fade, and like hope that does not die. "Odysseus, my little fox, you will be the one who causes anger, and you will be the one who brings pain, but you will also be the one who returns home. You will be the one who remembers where he came from, and who knows where he is going." Autolycus looked at her, and in his eyes was the same stillness that was in his heart as he looked upon this child. He did not speak a word, but his smile, as he looked at her, was as warm as the light that fell upon his face. He handed the child back to Eurycleia, and his hands, as they released him, were as gentle as the hands of a mother releasing her child into the world. "You will keep him," he said, and his voice was quiet, but in it was the same authority that was in his father when he commanded the gods. "You will keep him until he is strong enough to keep himself. And when he returns, when he stands before you covered in scars and dust, you will know him. You will know him by the scar he will receive on Parnassus, and you will say to him, 'You have returned, my little fox.'" Eurycleia nodded, and in that nod was everything she could not say in words: her gratitude, her hope, her promise that she would keep this boy, as one keeps a lamp in a dark corridor, and that she would remember this moment when he received his name, and that she would wait for the day when he returned home, and she would say to him, "You have returned, Odysseus. You have returned, my little fox." Little Odysseus ran through the courtyard faster than the lizards that basked on the stone walls, and his laughter, as he darted between the amphorae and the columns, was like the sound of the little bells they used to hang around the necks of the young goats in those summers when the world was still whole. Eurycleia stood in the inner courtyard of the palace of Laertes, and her eyes, as they followed him, were as warm as the sunlight that fell upon her face, and as calm as the surface of the water on a windless day. She watched him run, watched him fall, watched him rise and run again, and her heart, which had once been so cold and empty, now beat in time with his footsteps. "Be careful, my little fox," she called, and her voice was as light as the wind that rustled in the leaves of the olive trees. "Do not fall. Do not scrape your knee." But he did not listen. He ran as fast as if the gods themselves were chasing him, and his feet, as they stepped upon the stone slabs, were as quick as his thoughts, which were already beginning to work faster than those of any other child on this island. He stopped at the well, leaned over the water, and looked at his reflection, and his eyes, as they looked at themselves, were as dark as the wine-dark sea that surrounded this house. "Eurycleia," he called, and his voice was as clear as his laughter. "Look, I am here. I am looking at myself. I see my face. I see my eyes. I see myself." She walked to him, and her hands, as she touched his shoulder, were as gentle as leaves that touch the earth when they fall from the trees. She looked at his reflection in the water, and in that reflection she saw not merely a boy, but the one who would become a legend, the one who would change the world. And she knew that this moment, when he stands at the well and looks at himself, would remain with her forever, as forever remain those moments when you understand that your world has changed and that it has become greater than you could have imagined. You see yourself, my little fox, she said, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass. But you do not yet know who you will become. You do not yet know how far you will go. And you do not yet know that one day you will return, and I will be standing here, by this well, and I will be waiting for you. He looked at her, and his eyes were as wide as his soul, which seemed already to have begun to see what others could not see. He did not understand what she was saying, but he felt that these words were important, that they were part of his destiny. And he smiled at her, and his smile was like sunlight filtering through leaves, and like warmth that does not fade. And in the house behind them, the loom of a weaving woman was clacking, and its sound was like the heartbeat of the house, beating in time with his footsteps, and like the promise she had made to herself in the moment she first crossed the threshold of this house. She would keep him, as one keeps a lamp in a dark corridor, and she would remember him as he was in this moment, when he stood at the well and looked at his reflection. The wind blew from the sea, and its voice, as it rustled in the leaves of the olive trees, was like the whisper of ancient stories that old men told each other around the fire. Odysseus stood at the gates, and his hand, as it touched the neck of the horse, was firm and sure, like the hand of a man who knows his path will be long, but that he must walk it to the end. He was 16, and his face, as he looked at Eurycleia, was as serious as that of a grown man, but in his eyes was the same fire that had burned in him when he was a little boy running through the courtyard. "I am going to my grandfather," he said, and his voice was as steady as the surface of the water on a windless day, and as warm as the sunlight that fell upon his face. "I am going to Parnassus. I am going to learn who I am. I am going to become who I must be." Eurycleia stood at the gates, and her hands, as she clasped them upon her chest, trembled, but not from fear, from the strength that was in her as she watched this boy, who would become the greatest hero of Greece. She knew that his path would be long, that it would be full of dangers and trials, that he would meet monsters and gods, and that he would return home not as he was when he left. But she also knew that he must go, that he must find his destiny, that he must become who he was born to be. "Be careful, my little fox," she said, and her voice was quiet, but in it was the same strength that was in her heart when she held him in her arms for the first time. "Remember who you are. Remember where you came from. And remember that I will be waiting for you here, at these gates, when you return." He nodded and sprang onto the horse, and his feet, as they touched the stirrups, were as quick as his heartbeat and as firm as his resolve. He pulled the reins, and the horse, when he felt his hand, surged forward, and its hooves, as they struck the earth, were like the blows of a hammer upon an anvil. Eurycleia stood at the gates and watched him ride away, and her eyes, as they followed him, were full of the same light that was in her heart when she first held him in her arms. She heard his footsteps fading in the distance, mingling with the sound of the wind and the cries of the birds, and she knew that this moment, when he rode away, would remain with her forever, as forever remain those moments when you understand that your world has changed and that it has become greater than you could have imagined. The forest on Parnassus was thick and dark, and its shadows, as they fell upon the earth, were as long as time that flowed through the fingers, and as cold as the water that ran in the rivers that cut through the mountains. Odysseus walked ahead, and his hands, as they gripped the spear, were as firm as his resolve and as quick as his heartbeat. He knew the hunt would be dangerous, that the boar they were pursuing was old and cunning, and that its tusks were as sharp as the edge of a knife. But he was not afraid, because he was the son of Laertes and the grandson of Autolycus, and he knew that his destiny was greater than his fear. When the boar burst from the bushes, when its roar tore through the silence, and its body, huge and black as night, charged at him, Odysseus had no time to dodge. The tusk, as it pierced his thigh, was as swift as lightning and as sharp as the edge of a knife. He felt the blow, and his body, as he fell to the ground, was as heavy as a stone that drops into water. He lay upon the earth, and his blood, as it mingled with the dust, was warm and red, and his eyes, as they looked at the sky, were as wide as his soul, which seemed for a moment to have left his body. He heard the cries of his companions, as they ran to him, as they lifted him from the ground, as they carried him through the forest, and his eyes, as they looked at them, were full of the same pain that was in his heart when he understood that his journey was only beginning. He knew that this wound would be with him forever, that it would become his scar, his mark, his memory of having been on Parnassus, of having hunted the boar, of having survived. And he knew that this wound would be the one by which he would be recognized when he returned home. When Odysseus returned, the sun was already setting below the horizon, and its light, as it fell upon his face, was as pale as his skin and as cold as his breath. He sat upon his horse, and his hands, as they held the reins, trembled, but not from weakness, from the strength that was in him when he knew that he must reach home. His companions, who walked beside him, supported him, and their faces, as they looked at him, were full of the same pain that was in his heart when he understood that his wound was serious. Eurycleia stood at the gates, and her eyes, when she saw him, filled with tears. She ran to him, and her steps were as quick as her heartbeat and as light as her breath. She fell to her knees before him and raised her head, and her hands, when they touched his face, were as gentle as leaves that touch the earth when they fall from the trees. She looked at his pale face, at his eyes which were closed, and at his blood which flowed down his leg, and her heart, which had once been so cold and empty, now beat in time with his breathing. "Odysseus, my little fox," she cried, and her voice was as loud as her fear and as quiet as her hope. "What happened? Who did this? Who dared to wound my boy?" He opened his eyes and looked at her, and in his gaze was the same pain that was in his heart when he understood that his path would be long. He did not speak a word, but his hand, when it touched her hand, was as warm as his breath and as light as his hope. She knew that he was alive and that she would do everything to save him. "Help me," she called to her serving women. "Bring water, bring wine, bring clean cloths. Quickly, quickly." They lifted him, and their hands, as they carried him into the house, were as strong as their hearts and as gentle as their love. And when they laid him upon the bed, his face was as calm as the surface of the water on a windless day, and his breathing was as steady as his heartbeat. She stood beside his bed, and her hands, as she looked at him, trembled, but not from fear, from the strength that was in her when she knew that she must do everything to save him. She washed the wound with wine, and its hissing, as it touched the flesh, was like the whisper of wind in dry grass, and like the breath that escapes from the chest when you know that pain is part of life. She took a needle made of bronze, and horsehair thread, and her hands, as she began to stitch the wound, were as sure as the hands of a sculptor shaping form from clay, and as gentle as the hands of a mother holding her child. She worked in silence, and her breathing, as she breathed, was as steady as her heartbeat and as light as her hope. She sang an ancient song that she had heard from her mother when she was small, when the world was still young and she did not know what fear was. Her voice was quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. She sang of how the gods created the world, how they created men, how they created heroes, and how they created those who must keep the house when the heroes went to war. "You will live," she whispered, and her voice was as quiet as her breath, and as warm as her hands that touched his skin. "You will live, my little fox. You will live, and you will return home. I will do everything to bring you back." She tied the final knot, and her hands, as they released the needle, trembled, but not from weakness, from the strength that was in her when she knew that she had done everything she could. She wiped the blood from his leg, and her hands, as they touched his skin, were as gentle as leaves that touch the earth when they fall from the trees. She looked at his face, at his eyes which were closed, and she knew that this scar would be with him forever, that it would become his mark, his memory of having been on Parnassus, of having hunted the boar, of having survived. She rose and walked to the window, and her eyes, as they looked at the sea, were full of the same light that was in her heart when she first held him in her arms. She knew that this scar would be the one by which she would recognize him when he returned home, when he stood before her covered in scars and dust, and she would say to him, "You have returned, my little fox." On the day when word spread through the palace that young Odysseus was preparing to go and court Helen the Beautiful, Eurycleia stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and stared into the distance for a long time, her fingers nervously pleating the hem of her tunic. She knew this day would come, that sooner or later he would want to leave Ithaca and journey into the great world to find a bride worthy of his blood and his destiny. But she had not thought it would happen so soon, that he would choose the very one whose name already thundered across Greece, whose beauty was as dangerous as her fame. She walked to his room and stopped at the threshold. He sat by the window, and his hands, as they polished his armor, were as quick as his heartbeat and as sure as his resolve. The bronze breastplate, as he rubbed it with cloth, gleamed in the light of the setting sun, and its reflection, as it fell upon the walls, was like light that does not fade, and like hope that does not die. "You have heard, Eurycleia?" he asked, and his voice was as clear as the metal he was polishing, and as light as the wind that rustled in the leaves of the olive trees. "I am going to Helen. I am going to court her. I want her to be my wife." She looked at him, and her eyes, as she looked at him, were full of the same pain that was in her heart when she understood that his journey was only beginning, and that she could not stop him any more than she could stop the wind that blew from the sea. "She is too beautiful for you," she said, and her voice was quiet, but in it was the same strength that was in her heart when she held him in her arms, when she watched him ride away to his grandfather, when she stitched his wound. "She is too dangerous for you. She will bring you nothing but trouble." He turned to her, and his eyes, as they met hers, were as bright as the stars that were beginning to appear in the sky, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. "I am not afraid," he said. "I am Odysseus. I am the son of Laertes. I am the grandson of Autolycus. I am not afraid of beauty or danger. I want her. I want her to be mine." She did not answer. She simply stood at the threshold and watched him polish his armor, and her heart, which had once been so cold and empty, now beat in time with his breathing, and she knew that this moment, when he stood by the window preparing to leave, would remain with her forever, as forever remain those moments when you understand that your world has changed and that it has become greater than you could have imagined. You do not know what she is like, she said at last, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as the light that fell upon her face. You do not know that she is not merely a beautiful woman. She is one who has already been kidnapped, one who has already been a wife, one who has already brought misfortune. You do not know that her destiny is 5 husbands, and that you could become one of them if you are not careful. He looked at her, and in his gaze was the same resolve that was in his heart when he killed the boar on Parnassus, and the same confidence that was in his voice when he told her he would go to Helen. "I am not afraid of destiny," he said. "I am the master of my destiny, and I will do everything to make her mine, even if it means I must deceive the gods themselves." She did not answer. She simply stood at the threshold, and her hands, as she clasped them upon her chest, trembled, but not from fear, from the strength that was in her when she knew that he was leaving, and that she could not stop him. She watched as he rose, as he put on his armor, as he walked out of the room, and her eyes, as they followed him, were full of the same light that was in her heart when she first held him in her arms. She knew that his path would be long, that he would face many dangers, and that he would return home not as he was when he left. But she also knew that he must go, that he must find his destiny, that he must become who he was born to be. When he already stood at the gates, when his horse was already saddled and ready for the journey to the harbor, and when his eyes, as he looked at her, were full of the same resolve that was in his heart when he decided to go to Helen, she walked to him and took his hand. Her fingers, as they touched his skin, were as cool as the water in the well, and as warm as her breath, which escaped from her chest as she spoke. "I cannot stop you," she said, and her voice was quiet, but in it was the same strength that was in her heart when she held him in her arms, when she stitched his wound, when she watched him ride away to his grandfather. "I cannot stop you, because you are already grown, because you are already a man, because you have already decided what you must do. But I want you to know that I do not approve of your choice. I do not approve of your decision. I do not approve of your path." He looked at her, and in his eyes was the same stillness that was in his heart when he listened to her, and the same love that was in his soul when he thought of her as his second mother, his keeper, his light in a dark corridor. "I know you do not approve," he said. "I know you are afraid for me. I know you want me to stay here, in this house, with you, to be safe. But I cannot. I must go. I must do this." She shook her head, and her eyes, as she looked at him, were full of the same pain that was in her heart when she understood that his journey was only beginning, and that she could not stop him any more than she could stop the wind that blew from the sea. "You do not know what Helen is," she said, and her voice became stern, like the voice of a mother scolding her disobedient son. "I must tell you once more, I must repeat it. You do not know that she is not merely a woman. She is the one who has already been kidnapped. She is the one who has already been a wife. She is the one who has already brought misfortune. They say the Moirai have destined her to have 5 husbands, and that her destiny is not love but war. They say her beauty is not a blessing but a curse. They say she was already kidnapped by Theseus when she was still a girl, and that she has already brought death and destruction to those who loved her. Do you want to become one of them, my little fox? Do you want to become the one who will suffer because of her? I am not afraid of her beauty or her destiny," he said. I am not afraid of her past or her future. I am Odysseus. I am the son of Laertes. I am the grandson of Autolycus. I am not afraid of gods or men or fate. I will do everything to make her mine, even if it means I must deceive the Moirai themselves. You foolish boy, she said, and her voice became softer, like the voice of a mother stroking the face of her child. You foolish, stubborn, overconfident boy. But you are my boy. You are my little fox. I love you, and I am afraid for you. I am afraid you will not return. I am afraid you will suffer. I am afraid you will lose yourself in this world that is so cruel and so dangerous. He walked to her and embraced her, and in that embrace was everything he could not say in words. His gratitude, his hope, his promise that he would return, that he would not forget her, that he would remember this house, as one remembers light that does not fade. I will return, he said, and his voice was quiet, but in it was the same strength that was in his heart when he decided to go to Helen, and the same love that was in his soul when he thought of her. I will return, Eurycleia. I promise you. I will come home. I will come back to you. And she watched as he mounted his horse to set off for the ship, and she wanted to accompany him to the harbor, to see him sail away. When he already sat upon his horse, when his hand already gripped the reins, and when his face, as he looked at her, was as serious as that of a grown man, but in his eyes was the same fire that had burned in him when he was a little boy running through the courtyard, he looked at her and said, I know you think I am wrong. I know you think I am being foolish. I know you think I do not know what I am doing. But I know what I am doing. I do not want a boring girl with a face like a horse, and that is what all the respectable brides are like, the ones you would approve of. I want a beautiful wife. I want to become the husband of Helen. Eurycleia looked at him, and her eyes, as she looked at him, were full of the same pain that was in her heart when she understood that his journey was only beginning, and that she could not stop him any more than she could stop the wind that blew from the sea. You foolish boy, she said, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. You foolish, stubborn, overconfident boy. He smiled at her and at his mother, who stood beside her but remained silent, so that none of the servants could hear how her voice trembled with emotion. She was a queen and would not allow herself to show weakness. Odysseus pulled the reins, and the horse, when it felt his hand, surged forward, and its hooves, as they struck the earth, were like the blows of a hammer upon an anvil. They stood at the gates and watched him ride away, and they heard the steps of his horse fading in the distance, mingling with the sound of the wind and the cries of the birds, and they knew that this moment, when he rode away, would remain with them forever, as forever remain those moments when you understand that your world has changed and that it has become greater than you could have imagined. They arrived at sunset, the two of them, when the sun was already sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in those tender rose and golden tones that bloom each summer over the wine-dark sea, leaving behind a warm, soothing light that lay upon the road like a soft blanket. Eurycleia felt in her heart that she must go out to the gates, that someone important was coming, but she did not even dare to hope it would be Odysseus, and her eyes, when she saw the riders appearing on the hilltop, filled with tears, but she did not weep, because she knew that this moment was the very one she had been waiting for all those long days and nights, when her heart beat in time with his footsteps, when she counted the amphorae and listened to the wind whispering to her that he would return. She saw him first. Odysseus rode ahead, and his face, as he approached, was as calm as the surface of the water on a windless day, and as warm as the sunlight that fell upon his face. He was older than when he had left, and in his eyes was the same resolve that was in his heart when he told her he must find his destiny. But beside him, on a white horse, sat a woman, beautiful, with eyes as clear as the sky, and a smile as warm as the hands that held her. And when they drew near, when she saw her face, she understood that this was the very woman he had chosen, the very woman who was to become his wife. But it was not Helen. It was Penelope. Eurycleia ran to them, and her hands, as she raised her head and looked at him, trembled, but not from fear, from the joy that was in her heart when she saw him alive and unharmed. "My darling boy," she cried, and her voice was as loud as her joy and as quiet as her gratitude. "My clever little fox, you have returned. You have come home. I was so afraid you would not return. I was so afraid you would lose yourself in this world. But you have returned. You have returned, and you have brought this beautiful girl with you." She rose to her feet and turned to Penelope, and her hands, as she reached out to her, were as gentle as leaves that touch the earth when they fall from the trees, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. "My sweet girl," she said, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as her heart. "Welcome home. Welcome to our home." Eurycleia turned to a serving woman and, with a gesture or a barely audible word, sent her to inform King Laertes and the Queen of the news. Penelope smiled at her, and her smile was as warm as the hands that held her, and as gentle as the voice that spoke to her. "Thank you, Eurycleia," she said, and her voice was as soft as the whisper of waves, and as clear as the sky above them. "I have heard so much about you. I have heard that you are the soul of this house. I have heard that you are the one who keeps it when everyone leaves. I am so glad to finally meet you." She dismounted from her horse, and her hands, when they touched Eurycleia's shoulder, were as warm as her smile and as gentle as her voice. She stood beside Odysseus, and her face, as she looked at him, was as bright as the sun that had just set behind the horizon. She was the one he had chosen, the one who was to become his wife, the one who was to become his destiny. Odysseus leaped from his horse and walked to his nurse. "I have returned," he said, and his voice was quiet, but there was strength in it. "I have come home, Eurycleia, and I have brought with me the one who will become my wife, the one who will become my destiny." "You have done it," she said, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. "You have done it, my little fox. You have found your destiny. You have found your true love. And truly, you are the grandson of Autolycus, the craftiest man in Greece, to have understood so much about women at such a young age." They entered the house together, and their footsteps, as they stepped upon the stone floor, were light and joyful. The servants and serving women ran ahead of them, and word of the coming wedding of the young prince spread through the palace of Laertes with the speed of lightning. When a son was born to Odysseus and Penelope, when his cry, piercing and strong, filled the room, Eurycleia once again stood by the bronze basin of warm water, and her hands, as they received the infant, were as sure as on that day when she held his father in her arms. She lifted him toward the light, and in his eyes, when he opened them for the first time, she saw the same fire that had burned in the eyes of Odysseus when he was small and ran through the courtyard, and the same light that was in the eyes of Laertes when he paid 20 oxen for her. She also saw a glimmer of the same light in the eyes of old Autolycus. But that cunning one pretended it was only her imagination and that he was the soul of simplicity itself. "Hello, my little one," she whispered, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. "Hello, my little Telemachus. You will be like your father. You will be strong and wise. You will be the one who remembers his home, even when he is far away. You will be the one who returns." She raised him as she had raised his father. She taught him to walk, and her hands, as she held him, were as gentle as leaves that touch the earth when they fall from the trees. She taught him to speak, and her voice, as she spoke his name, was as warm as the fire that burned in the hearth. She taught him to be kind, to be honest, to be one who remembers that a home is not merely walls, but something greater, something that cannot be destroyed by time or war. They sat by the hearth, and her voice, as she told him stories, was as steady as the surface of the water on a windless day, and as warm as the light that fell upon his face. She told him of his grandfather Laertes, of his grandmother Eurycleia, of his grandfather Autolycus, who was the craftiest man in Greece, though for educational purposes she kept silent about the sins of Autolycus's youth, so as not to plant the seeds of cunning and deceit in Telemachus. "You will be a hero," she said, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. "You will be a hero, my little Telemachus. But first you must grow." The rumors of the Trojan War reached Ithaca like smoke rising above a burning forest, and Eurycleia, standing at the window, felt her heart, which had once been so calm and sure, begin to beat faster as she heard the voices speaking of how the Greeks were gathering for the campaign, how they were going to war against Troy, how Odysseus must join them because he had given an oath that could not be broken. She saw Odysseus changing, saw his face becoming serious, saw his eyes, as they looked at her, filling with the same unease that was in her heart when she understood that his journey was only beginning. And when she saw him walk out of the house, when she saw him yoke the ox and the donkey to the plow, when she saw him begin to plow the field, sowing it not with grain but with salt, she cried out. Her cry, as it tore from her chest, was as loud as her fear and as quiet as her hope. She stood at the window and watched him plow the earth, and her eyes, as she watched him, were full of the same pain that was in her heart when she understood that he was trying to deceive fate itself. "My poor, poor boy," she cried, and her voice was as loud as her despair and as quiet as her prayer. "What has happened to my little sunbeam? What has happened to my boy? Has he gone mad? Has he lost his mind? Has he forgotten who he is? Has he forgotten that he is Odysseus?" She watched him, the king's son, plowing the earth, his hands that had once gripped a sword and held a bow now gripping the plow, his face that had once been as clear as the sky over Ithaca now twisted in a grimace of madness. And she felt her heart, which had once been so cold and empty, tearing apart with pain. She heard the shouts of Palamedes, who had come to summon Odysseus to war, and stood at the fence watching this madness. And her ears, as they heard his voice and his curses, were as sharp as her fear. "He is pretending," she whispered to herself, and her voice was quiet, but in it was the same strength that was in her heart when she held him in her arms, and the same love that was in her soul when she waited for his return. "He is pretending so he will not have to go to war. He is pretending so he can stay home. He is pretending so he can be with his family. What will happen now? Oh, this will not end well." And so it happened. Palamedes took the infant Telemachus from the nurse Eurycleia's arms and laid him in the furrow before the plow. And Odysseus stopped. His hands released the plow, and everyone understood that the madness of Odysseus was a trick, but that this deception had been exposed. Odysseus stood motionless, and his face, as he looked at his son who lay in the furrow, was pale. He must go to war. He must leave his home, his wife, his son, his parents, his nurse, and he did not want to. Eurycleia stood and watched as Odysseus lifted his son from the ground, as he pressed him to his chest, as his eyes, when he looked at him, filled with tears he could not stop. And her heart beat in time with his breathing, and she knew that this moment, when he held his son in his arms, would remain with her forever, as forever remain those moments when you understand that your world has changed and that it has become greater than you could have imagined. Odysseus walked to Eurycleia and placed Telemachus in her arms, and she took him. And the next day, she stood with Penelope and Telemachus at the harbor and watched as his ship disappeared beyond the horizon, and her eyes, as they followed him, were full of the same light that was in her heart when she first held him in her arms. She heard the sound of the sea and the cries of the birds, and she knew that this moment, when he sailed away, would remain with her forever. She looked at the sea, which was as endless as her love and as wide as her hope, and she wanted to believe that he would return, because he was her boy, her little fox, her light in a dark corridor. 10 years of the Trojan War. 10 long, slow years during which time on Ithaca flowed not as it did on the battlefields, but as water that trickles over stones, unhurried yet inexorable, carrying away days, months, years that accumulated into a decade of waiting. Eurycleia rose each day before dawn, before the first ray of sun touched the tops of the olive groves, and her steps, as she walked through the corridors of the palace, were as sure as her heart, which never stopped waiting. She opened the storerooms, counted the amphorae, checked the stores of grain, oil, and wine. She knew that the house must live, must breathe, must be ready for the day when the master would return. And she did everything to make that day come. Sometimes, when the sun was already sinking toward the horizon and the shadows grew long, she heard the sound of hooves at the gates. She would drop everything and run to the entrance, her heart beating faster than her steps, and her eyes, when she saw the messenger, were full of the same hope that was in her heart when she waited for his return. She listened to the news, now victory, now defeat, now victory again, and her hands, as she listened, trembled, but not from fear, from the strength that was in her when she knew that he was alive, that he was fighting, that he had not forgotten his home. The war goes on, she said to herself, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. And life goes on. The olive trees still bear fruit. The sheep still give wool. We wait. We work. We hope. She returned to the house, and her steps were as firm as her resolve, and as light as her breath. She sat at the loom, and her hands, as they moved in time with its rhythm, were as quick as her heartbeat, and as sure as her hope. The monotonous clacking of the loom was like the heartbeat of the house, which continued to beat even when the master was far away, and like the promise she had made to herself in the moment she first crossed the threshold of this house. She would keep it, as one keeps a lamp in a dark corridor. And beside her, in the women's quarters, sat Penelope. She was like Eurycleia, yet entirely different. Her hands, as they wove, were as quick as her thoughts, and as gentle as her heart, which never stopped waiting for her husband. "Have you heard the news?" Penelope would ask, and her voice was quiet, but in it was the same unease that was in Eurycleia's heart when she listened to the messengers. "I have heard," Eurycleia would answer, and her voice was as steady as the surface of the water on a windless day, and as warm as the light that fell upon her face. "He is alive. He is fighting. He remembers his home. He will return." Penelope nodded, and in that nod was everything she could not say in words: her gratitude, her hope, her promise that she would wait, no matter how many years passed, no matter how many messages came, no matter how many doubts tormented her heart. She returned to her loom, and her hands, as they touched the threads, were as sure as her heart and as strong as her love. Eurycleia watched her, and her eyes, as she watched this woman who waited for her husband as she herself waited for her boy, were full of the same love that was in her heart when she held Odysseus in her arms, and the same hope that was in her soul when she waited for his return. She knew that they were bound not only by this house, but by this hope, this waiting, this faith that he would return. They worked together, two women who waited for the same man, and their voices, as they spoke to each other, were as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. They spoke of the house, of the children, of how he looked when he left, and of how he would look when he returned. And in these conversations was the same hope that was in their hearts when they waited for his return. Telemachus reminded them both of Odysseus. He was like his father in appearance and in voice, and when he spoke, and when he laughed with that same warm, spirited laugh. "He will return," the boy would say. "He will return, and I will wait for him, as you wait for him." And Eurycleia looked at him, and her eyes, as she looked at this boy, were full of hope. She knew that this house would endure, that it would wait, no matter how many years passed, no matter how many messages came, no matter how many doubts tormented their hearts. She knew that they would wait, because they were the ones who keep the house when the master goes to war, and the ones who greet him when he returns. And she knew that when he returned, they would be standing at the gates, two women who had waited for him, and their hands, when they embraced him, would be as warm as their hearts and as strong as their hope. It was an ordinary day, one of those that resemble all the others. The sun hung over the olive groves, the loom clacked steadily and monotonously, and the serving women chatted in the corridors when the sound of hooves at the gates rang out louder than usual. From the harbor, no doubt, a messenger. Eurycleia raised her head from the amphory of honey she was counting, and her heart, which over these 10 years had grown accustomed to rare tidings, beat faster. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the entrance. The messenger was covered in dust. His face was red with the emotions raging within him, but his eyes, as he looked at her, shone with the same light she had seen only in the happiest moments of her life. "The war is over," he cried, and his voice was as loud as his joy and as clear as the sky above them. "Troy has fallen. The Greeks have won. Odysseus is alive. He will soon be home." Eurycleia froze. Her hands, which still held the edge of her apron, trembled, and her eyes, as she looked at the messenger, filled with tears she could not stop. She heard these words, but she could not believe them. She had waited for this moment for 10 years, and now that it had come, she did not know what to do, did not know what to say, did not know how to express the joy that overflowed her heart. "He is alive?" she asked, and her voice was quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and trembling as a leaf that falls from a tree. "He is truly alive? He is truly coming home?" "He is alive," the messenger answered, and his smile, as he looked at her, was as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. He is alive, and he will return. He will come home. Eurycleia did not remember how she entered the house. She did not remember how she walked through the corridors, how she found herself in Odysseus's room, how she stopped at his bed and looked at his old tunic that hung on the wall. She remembered only one thing. She must prepare the house for his return. She must make it so that he would see that his home had waited for him, that his home had been preserved, that his home was ready to receive him. She turned to the serving women who stood at the door, and her voice, when she spoke, was as firm as her resolve and as clear as her hope. "Not a speck of dust must remain," she said, and in her voice was the same authority that was in her heart when she received the keys to this house. "He must see, he must know, we kept his home for him. Clean everything, wash everything, air every room. I want him to enter this house and feel that he never left it." The serving women stirred, and their steps, as they ran through the corridors, were as quick as their hearts and as light as their breath. They brought water, and its sound, as it splashed in the bronze basins, was like the sound of rain falling upon the earth, and like the promise she had made to herself in the moment she first crossed the threshold of this house. They washed the floors, wiped the walls, changed the bedding, and their voices, as they spoke to one another, were full of the same joy that was in Eurycleia's heart when she understood that he was alive. Eurycleia walked through the rooms, and her hands, as they touched the walls, were as gentle as the hands of a mother stroking the face of her child. She checked every detail, every speck of dust, every fold in the curtains. She walked to the old festive tunic that hung on the wall, and her fingers, as they touched the fabric, trembled, but not from weakness, from the strength that was in her when she knew that he would soon return. She smoothed it again and again, and in this gesture was everything she could not say in words. Her love, her hope, her promise that she had kept his home for him, and that she would wait for him at the gates when he returned. She walked out onto the porch, and her eyes, as she looked at the road that led to the sea, were full of the same light that was in her heart when she first held him in her arms, and the same love that was in her soul when she waited for his return. She knew that he would return. She knew that she was waiting for him. She knew that her life, which had been so long and so hard, now had meaning because he was coming home. She stood on the porch, and her hands, as she clasped them upon her chest, trembled, but not from fear, from the joy that overflowed her heart. She was waiting for him. She had always been waiting for him, and now, when he was returning, she was ready to greet him with the same love with which she had greeted him the first time, when he was small and looked at her as if she were the entire world. But Odysseus never returned. The years passed like water that flows over stones, leaving no trace but changing everything it touches. Eurycleia had grown old. Her hair, which had once been as dark as night, had become gray as the foam on the crests of waves, and her face, as she looked at the world, was cut with wrinkles like an old map on which all the roads she had traveled were marked. But her eyes, as they looked at the keys she held in her hands, were as keen as on the day she first crossed the threshold of this house, and her heart, which had once been so cold and empty, continued to beat in time with the breathing of the house she kept. She still often stood in the doorway of the storeroom, and her fingers confidently checked that the amphorae were securely sealed. She counted them again and again, those with honey, those with wine, those with oil, those for sale, those for their own use, and each time her fingers touched the clay, She felt how the time that had passed had settled upon them, as dust settles upon old things. From the great hall came the murmur of voices. The suitors were feasting there. They had come from all over Greece to court Penelope, and the old and feeble Laertes could not refuse them, could not show inhospitality. And their voices, as they laughed and sang, were as loud as their appetites, and as coarse as their desires. They drank wine from the cups of Odysseus, ate the cattle that belonged to him, and their footsteps, as they stomped upon the stone floor, were like the blows of a hammer upon an anvil, shattering the silence she had kept for so long. She clenched the keys in her hand, and their clinking, as they touched one another, was quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and warm as her heart, which had never stopped waiting. She knew that they could not destroy this house, because the house was not in its walls, but in the memory she kept, as one keeps a lamp in a dark corridor. She heard them laughing, demanding, harassing the serving women, and her hands, as she gripped the keys, trembled, but not from fear, from the strength that was in her when she knew that she must endure, that she must wait, that she must keep this house until he returned. She closed her eyes, and in the silence that was behind her, she heard only the clinking of the keys, which was like the promise she had made to herself in the moment she first crossed the threshold of this house. She would wait, she would keep, she would remember, and when he returned, she would stand at the gates, and her hands, when she embraced him, would be as warm as her heart and as strong as her hope. When the suitors first appeared in the house, when their voices filled the halls and their demands grew louder than the sound of the sea outside the windows, Penelope understood that she needed time. She could not tell them outright that she would not marry, that she would wait for Odysseus until the end of her days, that she would rather die than betray his memory. She knew that if she said this, they would not leave. They would demand, insist, threaten. She needed something else, a trick that would be as elegant as the fabric she held in her hands, and as strong as her love. "I will marry one of you," she told them one evening, and her voice was as calm as the surface of the water on a windless day, and as warm as the light that fell upon her face. "But first I must weave a shroud worthy of a king for the burial of my beloved father-in-law, King Laertes. He is old, and he will soon die. I cannot marry until I have fulfilled my duty to him. Give me time. Give me time to complete this work, and when I am finished, I will make my choice." The suitors agreed. They could not refuse her, because it was reasonable, because it was proper, because it was what any good wife and daughter-in-law should do. They did not know that it was a trap, that she was deceiving them, that she was using the accepted rules of propriety to buy herself time. Eurycleia was the only one who knew the truth. She stood beside Penelope as she wove, and her hands, as she handed her the threads, were as sure as her heart, which had never stopped believing. She watched as Penelope worked by day, her fingers, as they touched the threads, as quick as her thoughts, and as gentle as her love. She watched as she worked by night, unraveling everything she had woven by day, her hands, as they undid the knots, as resolute as her soul, which had never surrendered. "You have been doing this for 3 years," Eurycleia said one night, and her voice was quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass. "You weave by day and unravel by night. You are deceiving them, Penelope. You have been deceiving them for 3 years." "I know," said Penelope, and her voice was as warm as the light that fell upon her face, and as sure as her heart. "I will do this until he returns, or I will do this until there is no hope left." Eurycleia looked at her, and her eyes, as she watched this woman who waited for her husband as she herself waited for her boy, were full of the same love that was in her heart when she held Odysseus in her arms, and the same hope that was in her soul when she waited for his return. She knew that this shroud was not merely fabric. It was a weapon. It was a shield. It was a way to wait, no matter how many years passed, no matter how many nights she wove and unwove, no matter how many doubts tormented her heart. It was a trick as elegant as Penelope's love and as strong as her faith. Over the years of waiting, the son of Odysseus, Telemachus, had grown and become a young man, and when one day he said that he was setting out to search for his father, Eurycleia was not surprised. She knew this day would come, that he could no longer sit idle, listening to the suitors drinking wine from his father's cups, and watching his mother being pressured into an unwanted new marriage. Eurycleia packed provisions into his travel bag with her own hands and sent a trusted servant to check the conditions of the voyage on the ship by which Telemachus planned to sail. She gave him bread, wine, dried meat, and she knew that his journey would be long, that he would encounter many dangers, and she did not try to dissuade him, but she gave him instruction from the height of her years and the wisdom she had gained in life. "You must promise me one thing," she said, and her voice was quiet, but in it was the same strength that was in her heart when she held his father in her arms, and the same love that was in her soul when she waited for his return. "You must promise me that you will be careful. You must promise me that you will return. You must promise me that you will not risk your life needlessly. And you must promise me that you will tell no one that you are leaving. No one must know that you are searching for your father. No one must know that you are leaving this house. You will be silent for 12 days, Telemachus. 12 days you will keep your secret, and when you return, you will tell me everything you have learned. Do you promise?" He looked at her, and he understood that she was not speaking to a little boy who must be shielded from the dangers of the world at any cost, but to a man of the lineage of cunning people who always think ahead and calculate situations before they arise. "I promise," he said. She embraced him, and in that embrace was everything she could not say in words: her gratitude, her hope, her promise that she would wait for his return, and that she would stand at these gates when he came back. Telemachus departed. For 12 days Eurycleia counted the days as one counts the beats of a heart when waiting for news that does not come. She stood at the gates, and her eyes, as she looked at the road, were as keen as her heart, which had never stopped waiting. She listened to the wind, which carried to her the scent of the sea and the dust, and she waited for Telemachus. When at last he appeared on the road from the harbor, when his figure, drooping and weary, showed against the sunset, she ran out to him, and her steps were as quick as her heartbeat. She saw his face as he approached, and in his eyes there was not the hope that had been there when he left. There was only emptiness, as empty as her heart when she understood that he had not found what he was looking for. "I did not find him," he said, and his voice was quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as empty as his heart. "No one has seen him. No one has heard of him. He has vanished, Eurycleia. He has vanished, and I do not know if he will return." "He will return," she said. "He will return, Telemachus. I know it. I feel it. He cannot fail to return. He cannot leave us. He cannot leave this house. He will return, so we will wait for him, as we have always waited for him." He looked at her, and he did not know whether he believed her words in that moment, but he knew that he wanted to believe, that he wanted her to be right. He knew that his father must return. He knew that his father could not have abandoned them, and he knew that they would wait for him, No matter how many years passed, no matter how many messages came, no matter how many doubts tormented their hearts, they entered the house together, and their footsteps, as they stepped upon the stone floor, were as quiet as their breath, and as sure as their resolve. Eurycleia watched as he walked down the corridor, and she understood that she should not follow him. He needed to be alone. Penelope sat on a low bench by the hearth, and her face, as she looked at the beggar who stood in the shadow of the column, was weary, like the face of one who no longer expects a miracle. She did not know why she had allowed this stranger to enter the house, why she had ordered Eurycleia to wash his feet, why she felt that she must do this, must believe that he knew something of her lost husband Odysseus and could tell her much. She simply knew that this man was no ordinary beggar, that in his eyes was the same fire she had seen in her husband's eyes when he left for war, and that meant this was a serious man who would speak to the point. Wash his feet, she said to Eurycleia, so that the custom of hospitality might be observed in the royal house, even though the stranger's status did not match that of a guest in the palace. Penelope's voice was quiet, but in it was the same strength that was in her heart when she decided to weave the shroud for Laertes and stand her ground to the end. Eurycleia nodded, and her steps, as she walked to the kitchen, were as sure as her heart, which had never stopped believing. She took the bronze basin, as old as the walls of this house, and filled it with warm water. She carried it through the hall, and set the basin before the ragged stranger, and her eyes, as she looked at him, were no longer as keen as on the day she first crossed the threshold of this house, for the years had taken their toll. But Eurycleia felt that this man was the one she was meant to meet, the one who would change everything, the one who would bring hope back to this house. She knelt down, and her hands, when they touched his feet, were as gentle as leaves that touch the earth when they fall from the trees. She began to wash his feet, and the water, as it splashed in the basin, was warm and clear as her hope, and as transparent as her faith that Odysseus would one day return. Her still gentle fingers, as they moved over the stranger's skin, performed the confident, habitual movements of an elderly woman. Over the years of living in the royal house, she had many times received important guests with honor and personally washed their feet, because important guests and messengers constantly arrive at a royal house, and no king could conduct his affairs, his politics, his economic matters successfully otherwise. Eurycleia washed his feet, and suddenly, oh no, it could not be, her fingers encountered a scar on his leg, and when they touched the old wound, which was as familiar to her as her own face, she froze. She could not breathe. She could not move. She looked at this scar, at the white, thin mark that was like the mark of lightning on old bark. She could barely see it. Her eyes were failing her, but even by touch she would never have confused this scar with any other. She herself had stitched this wound, when the wild boar tore open the leg of her Odysseus. She raised her eyes, and her gaze, when it met his gaze, and it was, of course, him, became as clear as the sky over Ithaca, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. She recognized him. She recognized his eyes, his face, his soul. She recognized her boy, her little fox, her light in a dark corridor. She did not cry out, did not weep, did not speak a word. She simply knelt, and her hands, as she held his leg, trembled, but not from fear, from the joy that overflowed her heart. She knew that he had returned. She knew that her life, which had been so long and so hard, now had meaning, because he was here before her, and her hands, as they touched his scar, were as gentle as on that day when she first held him in her arms. He saw her gaze. He saw how her eyes widened, how her fingers froze on his leg, how her breath stopped. He understood that she had recognized him, that his secret was revealed. And he knew that if she spoke, if she betrayed him, his plan would fail, and he would not be able to save his home, his wife, his people. And Odysseus had a plan, and after so many years of war, wanderings, and deaths, he no longer knew whether he could trust anyone in this world at all, even his old and once beloved nurse. He was no longer a tender, vulnerable flower, but a harsh warrior who had lost everything that could be lost in this life, except life itself. Odysseus seized Eurycleia by the throat, and his hand, as it closed around her neck, was rough. He pulled her toward him, and his voice, when he spoke, was quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, but hard. "Be silent," he said, and his voice was as cold as the water in the well. "Be silent, Eurycleia. You must tell no one that I am here. You must swear to me that you will be silent. You must swear to me that you will tell no one, not even Penelope, that I have returned. You must swear to me that you will wait until I myself decide when to reveal myself." She looked at him, and in her eyes there was no fear. There was only the same love that was in her heart when she held him in her arms, and the same hope that was in her soul when she waited for his return. She was not afraid of his hand on her neck. She was not afraid of his voice, as cold as his resolve. She was afraid of only one thing, that he would leave again, that he would disappear again, that he would leave her alone once more. "I will swear," she whispered, and her voice was quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and warm as her heart. "I will swear that I will be silent. I will swear that I will tell no one that you are here. I will swear that I will wait until you yourself decide when to reveal yourself. I will do whatever you say, Odysseus. I will do whatever you ask, because you are my boy. You are my little fox. You are my light in a dark corridor. I will never betray you. I will never betray you." He looked at her, and in his eyes, as he looked at her, was the same love that was in his heart when he was small and ran through the courtyard, and the same hope that was in his soul when he thought of her. He released her throat. He felt that he could trust her. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for not forgetting me. Thank you for loving me. I have returned, Eurycleia. I have come home. Tell me what is happening." And Eurycleia told him. For 3 years Penelope had woven the shroud for Laertes. Each day she sat at the loom, and her fingers, as they touched the threads, moved in time with her breathing, and each evening, when the light faded beyond the windows and the house sank into silence, she unraveled everything she had accomplished. She did this not because she was afraid, but because she knew. Once the fabric was finished, once she had fulfilled her promise, the suitors would demand her choice, and she could no longer wait for Odysseus. She bought time thread by thread, day by day, year by year, and this deception was her only weapon against a world that wanted to take her hope away. But every secret has its price. The serving women who lived in the house finally managed to discover Penelope's secret. They spied on her as she wove by day, and they saw her unravel by night. They saw her tears, her fear, her despair. And one of them, named Melantho, could not bear it. She was young and beautiful, and her heart was as cold as her smile when she looked at the suitors. Without shame or conscience, she shared their beds, and she told them everything she knew about the house that gave her shelter and work and sustenance, and which she betrayed. She told the suitors that the queen had been deceiving them for 3 years, and the suitors, learning the truth, flew into a rage. They demanded that Penelope make her choice immediately. Penelope stood before them, and her face, as she looked at them, was as calm as the surface of the water on a windless day, but inside her everything trembled. She knew she could delay no longer, that there was no shroud, no reprieve, no hope left. She stood in the center of the hall, and her hands, as she clasped them upon her chest, were as cold as her heart, which beat in time with her fear. She knew she must say something, must do something, must find another way to buy time. And then she raised her eyes and spoke the words that were to be her last hope. "I will marry the one who can string the bow of Odysseus and shoot an arrow through 12 rings," she said, and her voice was as steady as her breathing, and as warm as the light that fell upon her face. "This is my will. This is the will of the gods. The one who can do this will take the place of my husband Odysseus, will be as he was to me, and will become king of Ithaca." Penelope knew that only one man in this world could string that bow, and that was Odysseus himself, and she hoped that no one would pass this trial, and it would give her a reprieve, and she would try to think of something else. All the suitors gathered in the great hall. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, and its rays, breaking through the high windows, fell upon the stone floor in long golden bands that crossed the room like threads of fate woven by some invisible hand upon an ancient loom. There were more than 100 suitors, and their voices, as they spoke among themselves, were as loud as their confidence that they would succeed at what seemed to them such a simple trial, for every one of them had been trained in archery since childhood. They stood around the throne, and their faces, as they looked at Penelope, were full of the same greed that was in their hearts when they drank wine from the cups of Odysseus and ate his cattle. They did not know that this bow was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of the house they were trying to destroy. One by one the suitors approached the bow. They tried to string it, and their faces, as they strained, reddened with effort, and their hands, as they gripped the horn, trembled with helplessness. But the bow would not yield. It remained as immovable as the walls of this house, and as firm as its master, who had once held it in his hands. They retreated, and their faces, as they looked at the bow, were full of the same frustration that was in their hearts when they understood that they were not worthy of this woman, this house, this destiny. Eurycleia stood in the shadow of a column, and her hands, as she clasped them upon her chest, were as tense as her heart, which beat in time with her breathing. She watched as one by one they tried to string the bow, and in her eyes was the same hope that was in her heart when she waited for his return. She knew that none of them could do it. She knew that only one man in this world could string that bow, and that man now stood in the shadow of another column, dressed in rags, his face hidden beneath dirt and dust. She watched as he stepped forward. She saw how his hand, as it touched the bow, trembled, but not from weakness, from the strength that was in him when he decided to return home, and from the love that was in his soul when he thought of Penelope. She heard the suitors laughing, their voices saying that this beggar could not do what they had failed to do, their mockery as they jeered at him. But she paid them no attention. She looked only at him, at his hands that gripped the bow, and at his eyes that were as clear as the sky over Ithaca. He strung the bow. It was as easy as breathing, and his hands, as they bent the horn, were as sure as his heart, and as quick as his thoughts. He set an arrow to the string, took aim, and released it, and it flew through all 12 rings, and their clattering as they fell upon the stone floor was like the sound of little bells they used to hang around the necks of young goats in those summers when he was small and learning to run across these stone floors. Eurycleia exhaled. She watched as he stood there, bow in hand, and her eyes, as she looked at him, filled with tears, but she did not weep, because she knew that this moment was the very one she had been waiting for all those long years, when she counted the amphorae, when she waited for news, when she looked at the sea and hoped. She knew that he had returned. She knew that the king had returned. She knew that her boy had come home. But this was only the beginning. Odysseus cast off his rags, and his face, as he stood before them, was as clear as the sky over Ithaca, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. He took the bow in his hands, and his voice, when he spoke, was as loud as his wrath, and as cold as his heart, which beat in time with his breathing. "I am Odysseus," he said, and his words fell upon the floor like stones that can no longer be lifted. "I have returned to my home, and I have come to punish those who defiled it. You drank my wine, you ate my bread, you slept with my serving women, you demanded my wife. Now you will pay for this." He began to shoot, and his arrows, as they flew, were as swift as his anger, and as precise as his hatred. One by one the suitors fell to the floor, and their bodies, as they convulsed in their death throes, were as heavy as their pride and as empty as their souls. They did not have time to understand what was happening, to defend themselves, to flee. Their death was punishment for their arrogance. And when the last of them fell, when his body struck the stone floor, a silence fell upon the hall, deeper than any silence this house had ever known. When the last suitor fell, when his body, as heavy as his pride, struck the stone floor, and when his blood mingled with the blood of the others that flooded the hall, Odysseus stood in the center of the room, and his breathing, as he breathed, was as steady as his heart and as cold as his gaze. He looked at the bodies that lay around him, and in his eyes there was neither pity nor joy, only the same stillness that was in his soul when he understood that his house had been defiled, and that he must purify it so that it might once again be his home. "Eurycleia," he said, and his voice was as steady as the surface of the water on a windless day, and as cold as his heart, which beat in time with his breathing. "Name them for me. Name those who betrayed my house. Name those who slept with the suitors, who drank my wine, who ate my bread, who laughed at me and at my wife. Speak their names." Eurycleia stood before him, and her hands, as she clasped them upon her chest, were as calm as her heart, which had never stopped believing. She looked at him, and her eyes, as she looked at him, were as clear as the sky over Ithaca, and as warm as sunlight filtering through leaves. She knew them all. She knew their names, their faces, their voices. She knew who had been faithful to the house and who had betrayed it. And she knew that she must name them so that the house might be purified. "Melantho," she said, and her voice was steady as her breathing and cold as her heart as she spoke that name. She was the most beautiful of them, but her soul was as black as her hair. She slept with Eurymachus, and she told him everything she knew about the house. She told him about the shroud, about your wife, about your son. She betrayed you, Odysseus. She betrayed your house. She paused, and in the silence that followed her words, only the sound of Odysseus's breathing and the wind outside the windows could be heard. "Philithia," she continued, and her voice was as steady as her breathing and as cold as her heart. She was quiet and unassuming, but she too slept with the suitors. She too told them what was happening in the house. She too betrayed you. She named them all. 12 names, 12 voices, 12 lives that were bound to this house, but had betrayed it. She spoke their names, And in this recitation there was not only pain, but also release. She knew that these names had to be spoken, so that the house could be purified, and so that those who remained could live in peace. "Is that all?" asked Odysseus, and his voice was as steady as his breathing, and as cold as his heart. "That is all," she answered, and her voice was as quiet as the whisper of wind in dry grass, and as warm as her heart. "That is all who betrayed your house. That is all who must be punished." He nodded, and in that nod was everything he could not say in words: his gratitude, his hope, his promise that he would remember this moment, when she stood before him and spoke the names of those who had betrayed his house. When the bodies had been removed, when the blood had been washed from the floor, and when a silence deeper than any silence they had ever known settled upon the hall, Eurycleia brought the sulfur. She entered the hall, and her steps, as she walked across the stone floor, were as quiet as her breath, and as sure as her heart. She carried in her hands a bronze bowl in which pieces of sulfur burned, and their smoke, as it rose toward the ceiling, was as thick as her faith, and as pure as her hope. She stopped in the center of the hall, and her hands, as she raised the bowl above her head, were as sure as her resolve, and as strong as her love. She began to fumigate the room, and her movements, as she moved through the hall, were as smooth as the waves that roll onto the shore, and as precise as her memory, which knew every corner, every crack, every shadow in this house. The smoke of sulfur rose toward the ceiling, and its smell, as it mingled with the air, was as sharp as her pain, and as pure as her hope. It penetrated every crevice, every crack, every shadow, and it burned away everything that was unclean, everything that was foreign, everything that was treacherous. Eurycleia walked through the hall, and her figure, as she moved through this smoke, was like the figure of a priestess performing an ancient ritual to cleanse a temple of evil. She saw how the smoke enveloped the walls, how it penetrated every crack, how it burned away everything that was foreign, and she knew that this ritual was not merely purification, but restoration. It was the return of the house to what it had been when it was whole, when it was clean, when it was home. She knew that when the smoke cleared, when the smell of sulfur faded, the house would once again be what it had been, and that it would once again be ready to receive its master. She walked to the hearth, and her hands, as she set the bowl upon the stone, were as gentle as the hands of a mother stroking the face of her child. She looked at the fire that burned in the hearth, and her eyes, as she looked at it, were full of the same light that was in her heart when she first crossed the threshold of this house, and the same love that was in her soul when she waited for his return. She knew that this house had endured. She knew that it had survived war, famine, the invasion of the suitors, and her own loneliness. She knew that it had once again become what it was, and that its master had returned home. She stood at the hearth, and her hands, as she clasped them upon her chest, trembled, but not from fear, from the strength that was in her when she knew that all was over, that the house was purified, that it was once again ready to receive those who were meant to live in it. She heard behind her Odysseus approaching the hearth, and his steps, as he walked across the stone floor, were as sure as his heart and as warm as his breath. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was quiet, but in it was the same strength that was in his heart when he decided to return home, and the same love that was in his soul when he thought of her. "Thank you for waiting for me together with my wife Penelope. Thank you for keeping my house. Thank you for believing in me." She turned to him, and her eyes, as she looked at him, were full of the same love that was in her heart when she held him in her arms, and the same hope that was in her soul when she waited for his return. She did not speak a word. She simply stood at the hearth. She knew that this moment, when she stood at the hearth purified by sulfur and looked at her boy who had come home, would remain with her forever, as forever remain those moments when you understand that all is well, that all is over, that you can finally rest.